Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're tracing the epic, multinational journey of the Nile River. It's literally a geographical marvel that shaped human history. And today, it's sitting right at the center of a high-stakes battle for survival. We're going to unpack the geography, the hydrology, and the modern reality of this incredibly powerful, yet incredibly fragile water system. Okay, let's kick things off with a number that's just kind of hard to wrap your head around. 7,088 kilometers, or, about 4,400 miles. At that astounding length, this natural wonder officially holds the title of the longest river in the entire world. And it doesn't just clip a couple of borders. Its massive drainage basin stretches across 11 different countries, from the mountains of Rwanda and Burundi all the way up to the shores of Egypt. But here's where it gets really fascinating. There's this wild paradox at play. The Nile completely dominates in physical length, right? But if you look at the actual volume of water it discharges, it carries just a fraction compared to global heavyweights like the Amazon or the Congo. For a river this long, the amount of water it ultimately pushes into the Mediterranean Sea is surprisingly low. So it's a massive, sprawling river, but a highly delicate one when it comes to actual water supply. To really understand how this delicate system works, we're going to hit 5 key areas today. First up, the longest river. Then, finding the sources. Next, geography of the flow. Number 4 is hydrology and sediment. And finally, we'll wrap up with the modern water balance. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the longest river, a ribbon of life in the desert. The reach of the Nile is just absolutely immense. The basin covers nearly 3 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 10% of the entire African continent. And because of this sprawling footprint, it supports a wild variety of climates and ecosystems. It literally captures water from rainy forested mountains in the deep south and carries it straight across the arid, sandy deserts of the north. Moving right along to section 2, finding the sources, the 2 great arteries. So what's really cool is that the main Nile isn't just one single stream. It's actually a tale of 2 very different rivers. You've got the White Nile, which gives us this steady, constant flow originating down near Lake Victoria in Rwanda. And then contrast that with the Blue Nile, coming out of the Ethiopian highlands near Lake Tana. The Blue Nile is way shorter, but it's fueled by these explosive, torrential seasonal rains. So it's steady and flat on one hand versus short and explosive on the other. Okay, section 3. Geography of the flow. Mapping the 4,400-mile journey. Geographically speaking, we can break this epic downstream journey into 5 major regions. We start way down south in the African Great Lakes, moving water through Lake Victoria and Lake Albert. Then it transitions north into the Mountain Nile region in South Sudan. After that, it flows into the broader White Nile region, merges with the Blue Nile to become the main Nile running through the Sahara, and finally fans out into the famous Nile Delta at the Mediterranean Sea. But right in the middle of this journey is a massive obstacle. As the water travels through the Mountain Nile region of South Sudan, it hits the Sud. And the Sud is this huge, incredibly flat swamp. I mean, look at that incline, a 1 to 13,000 rise over run. It's practically perfectly flat. Because of that, the river just hits the brakes and widens completely out. You've got dense vegetation like papyrus and water hyacinth acting like a giant biological sponge. It's literally nature's ultimate speed bump. Roughly half of the White Nile's water is lost right there to evaporation before it even has a chance to reach the desert. Next up is section 4, hydrology and sediment, the math and the mud. Now, when we actually break down where all the main Nile's water comes from, the numbers are pretty surprising. The Blue Nile kicks in a massive 54% of the total water. The White Nile? Well, despite being the longer headwater, it only contributes about 32%, and that's exactly because of those huge evaporation losses back in the Sud Swamp we just talked about. The Atbarar River pitches in the final 14%. So, interestingly enough, the torrential Blue Nile actually provides the vast majority of the river's volume, even though it's the much shorter tributary. And get this, it's not just water pouring out of Ethiopia, it's literally land too. Those torrential seasonal rains in the Ethiopian highlands are so incredibly powerful that they carve away the bedrock. Over millions of years, an estimated 102,000 cubic kilometers of rock have been eroded, carried downstream as suspended sediment, and then dumped at the river's mouth. That mud is what literally built the 150,000 cubic kilometers soil bed of the Nile Delta. So the rich, fertile soil of Egypt, it's basically just the Ethiopian mountains, ground up fine and delivered by the river. This brings us to our final stop, section 5, the modern water balance. Sources and sinks. To really grasp this like a hydrologist would, we need to define a couple of quick terms for our ledger. A source is simply a region that adds water to the river system, usually through heavy rainfall. Makes sense, right? A sink, on the other hand, is a region that removes water from the system. That could be naturally through intensive evaporation or artificially by humans pulling water out for crop irrigation. When you look at the nations of the Nile through this source and sink lens, you uncover a pretty harsh geographic reality. The upstream countries, like Ethiopia and Uganda, are your sources, but the downstream countries, South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt, they are the sinks. They're mostly arid and rely super heavily on this water for agriculture and basic survival. So the nations physically supplying the water are geographically totally separate from the nations desperately needing to withdraw it. And that tension brings us to today's modern reality. Look, since the late 20th century, human engineering has completely rewritten how this ancient river works. We're talking over a dozen major dams, like the Aswan High Dam in Egypt and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, yes, they provide absolutely vital hydropower and irrigation, but those reservoirs have also totally altered the ancient seasonal flood cycles. Even worse, those dams physically trap that nutrient-rich Ethiopian sediment behind their concrete walls. Because that fresh soil is no longer flowing downstream to replenish the coast, the massive 22,000 square kilometer Nile Delta is actively shrinking right now, just washing away into the Mediterranean Sea. So, we've seen how the Nile is the world's longest river, we've traced its two totally distinct arteries, seen it lose water to massive swamps, and watched it carry literal mountains of sediment to the sea. But today, that ledger is tighter than ever, which leaves us with a huge question to ponder. As populations boom and global water scarcity looms, how can 11 different nations peacefully balance the delicate ledger of a heavily dammed, shrinking river? It's a massive puzzle, and how they solve it will absolutely define the future of Northeast Africa. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the world around you.